So we'll go ahead and light our chalice. And again, if you'll mute yourselves, that would be great, but you can go ahead and say this along with me. We light this chalice for the web of life which sustains us, for the sacred circle of life in which we have our being, for the earth, the sky, above and below, and for our Mother Earth, and for the mystery. Candles tipping over here. So the chalice is lit. So let's start off with this question. Where do you feel most connected with the natural world? I imagine it's different for each of us. Talking about naturalism today, so in talking about religious naturalism, we need to start off with, well, what is naturalism? And this is a perspective or a view of the world in which only nature exists. Everything that exists is within nature. So there's not a supernatural realm. And the scientific method is how we approach truth. So if we're trying to understand the nature of things, we use the scientific method. So what is nature and what is natural? In this perspective, everything is part of nature. Everything is natural. But there can be healthy or unhealthy things, and different pieces of nature might benefit or experience something as a detriment, depending on our little perspective in the world, or a bigger perspective. But we don't have in this from a religious naturalist perspective, everything is part of nature and everything is natural, including arts and culture. So I think a lot of times, when we think about nature, when I think about nature, I think of biology, I think of chemistry, I think of physics, but also art and culture are part of nature. And art and culture are ways to tie it to science, to tie it to the other fields that I was just mentioning. Art and culture are ways that we process our experiences of life. They're ways that they're strategies that help us survive and thrive in the world. They're ways that we communicate with one another. And they also help us express a sense of reverence. So religious naturalism takes that perspective and thinks of it in terms of values, beliefs, and attitudes. So it adds this sense of values, beliefs, and attitudes on top of just the naturalism might be thought of as kind of a cold framework of the world, but the religious aspect of it really warms it up in my way of thinking. So we can think about, okay, well, what values, beliefs, or attitudes might we have if we think of the world in terms of nature being all there is, that nature is all that exists, and that there's not some sort of supernatural realm to give us a sense of meaning. For many of us, this inspires awe and wonder. So especially when we might be outdoors, or we might be experiencing some new technology, or we might be learning about how our bodies work or how ecology works. This can really just inspire a sense of wonder and a sense of sacredness, that we have a sense of wanting to care for that we have a sense of importance and meaning that we associate, perhaps coming from this perspective, certainly. And then we can add meaning and purpose using that framework. So the religious piece is really adding or the factor of the sense of awe, reverence, sacredness, and meaning that attaches with the naturalism. And oftentimes this leads people to a sense of love, reverence, and devotion, especially toward the natural world. But it can also be connected with what we are part of the natural world as human beings. So love, reverence, and devotion toward one's fellow people as well. The Religious Naturalist Association says that religious naturalists believe the beauty, wonder, and science of nature is an essential foundation for our pursuit of knowledge and personal fulfillment. And the founders of the Religious Naturalism Association, so the RNA, they say pun intended. So, RNA, Religious Naturalist Association, or ribonucleic acid that we've all been hearing a lot about lately. So I enjoy that connection. So what about God? Well, from this perspective, there's not going to be a supernatural God. However, a lot of people find that in the English language, there's something about the term God. They've made that connection that there's just no other word that captures what they're trying to get at. And so people use the word God to mean a lot of different things. So some understandings of God that make sense in a religious naturalist perspective include the ground of being. So God as the ground of being I kind of think of it as the soil. So we've got this picture of the soil and plants growing from the soil, and what we see might be the plants, but there's not really a distinction or a perfect disconnection at one point between the plant and the soil. The soil is the plant is the soil. They're kind of going back and forth. One is becoming one another. It's a cycle of one becoming the other and then back to the first. So this is a perspective of God as the ground of being that would work from a religious naturalist perspective. There's also process theology, which is this idea that some larger system or presence or being is working with us in a process to create what happens in our lives. So process theology is one way of looking at God through this perspective. And then also pantheism versus panentheism. So a pantheistic understanding of God, which is that God is equal to all of nature. That would work from a religious naturalist perspective. So thinking of God as the totality of nature. Panentheism is this idea that that God is nature, but also something beyond nature. So it kind of adds a supernatural aspect to it that that isn't part of religious naturalism. So panentheism, where God is nature, is one way of thinking of God in a religious naturalist perspective. So story and ritual. We, as human beings, we seem to just really connect with story and ritual. It seems to be a really important piece of life for all of us. For a long time, I denied this for myself. I thought, no, I just want the facts. But more and more, I'm coming to terms with how important story is for me and for everybody for everybody I know, there's a story that's important to them. And religious naturalism takes into account these human, the way we are as humans and our human needs. And so metaphor, art, artistic expression in words and stories is all seen as useful tools to help us understand and connect with the world. In particular, religious naturalists have said, it's really important for people to have a story about how the world came to be, why it exists, and especially a connecting story. So there are lots of stories, many religions have one particular story that is really important to them. In Christianity, the story is that this God human came to live among humans to redeem us from, there are lots of different ways of interpreting this, but basically to redeem the humans, and died in order to redeem the humans. So that's one particular story. But the story that religious naturalists use is the epic of evolution, and the arc of everything that has happened that we can imagine about how the universe began, how Earth came to be, how life came to be on Earth, and how it has continued to evolve. And the idea and the hope is that this could be everybody's story, that it could be a shared story for all people. Solstices and equinoxes. So solstices are the summer and winter points at which the sunlight is the least and the most. Although I got that backwards. In the summer, it's the most sunlight, the point at which we have the most sunlight. In the winter time, the winter solstice is when we have the least sunlight. And the equinoxes are when the sun is lined up with the equator. So we have more even balance of light and dark during the spring equinox and the fall equinox. And these are times that many religious naturalists I know choose to celebrate, choose to use as times of reflection. However, we don't have a lot of stories and rituals that are specifically religious naturalists. So I invite you to think about, what do you value? What's most meaningful here as far as your connection with the natural world or values that you have? And how might you design a ritual for yourself or your community that reflects those values? Just some things to think about. So what does it look like to live as a religious naturalist? Well, of course, there are lots of ways. So going back to this sense of what is a religious naturalist, it's somebody with a particular perspective of the world where nature is all that exists and there's not a supernatural realm, and somebody who also has a sense of awe and wonder and a sense of reverence toward this natural world that they believe is all that exists. So a few ways might be studying science. So whereas other people might study a religious text like the Quran, religious naturalists might choose to study science to better understand the world. By paying attention to experience. So in some ways, Buddhist practitioners and other meditation practitioners are being scientists with their own experience and the way their minds work, by paying attention to what goes on in themselves and what goes on in their own thoughts and behavior and feelings. And another way is to be an advocate for conservation and diversity. So there are lots of things that come out of this perspective and this sense of reverence for the natural world. So I've got some books for you, just in case you're interested in looking more into this. The Sacred Depths of Nature by Ursula Goodenough it's kind of like a devotional. It's easy reading. It's short pieces that can be read one at a time, and on your nightstand, for instance, this would be a good one. Black Lives and Sacred Humanity is by Carol Wainwright, and this is recognizing the African American contributions to religious naturalism. When God is gone, everything is holy. The Making of a Religious Naturalist. This is more of like a memoir about Chet Ramo's experience of being a religious naturalist. Religious Naturalists Today, The Rebirth of a Forgotten Alternative, talks about how religious naturalism is reemerging as a more and more popular way of looking at the world. Nature is Enough so some of these books are pretty heady. These last three, the first three, okay, so Sacred Depths of Nature and When God Is Gone, Everything is Holy are a little more easy reading, and the rest of them can get kind of heady. They're intellectual, academic. So just a heads up. And then the last one is The Promise of Religious Naturalism by Michael Hogue, which talks about where the future could go with religious naturalism becoming a more prevalent philosophy. There's also the Religious Naturalist Association that I mentioned earlier. Religious-naturalist-association.org is their website, and they just redid their website, and I like it a lot. It's a good place to go to learn more. It's free to join the association, and there are plenty of fellow UUs who are part of this association already. So next up, Lauren's going to share a little bit, but I wanted to give this, basically we're going to play this song, Ancient Mother, and I wanted to give this attribution on the screen before we do. So after Lauren speaks, we're going to play this song, so you have some time to reflect before we go into discussion groups.
Thanks, Meredith. Okay, good morning. I'm Lauren Logan, and I've been a member of UUC for a little over 6 years. And how I became part of this morning's faith formation experience during a getting to know you conversation, Meredith introduced me to the term of religious naturalism when I shared with her that my spirituality seems strongly connected to nature. And Meredith pointed me to a website and gave me the title of some books to research more on the topic. And the next thing I know, I'm preparing to share my story with you this morning. So Meredith is a very persuasive woman. I was born, raised, and had a 21-year career with the telephone company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. After taking an early retirement, I felt the need to reevaluate and rejuvenate. And I decided the best place to do this would be my family's vacation cottage on Harris Lake in the community of Winchester, Wisconsin. Winchester is, if you're familiar with the area, north of Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin, and south of Ironwood, Michigan. Those are the two largest communities nearest to Winchester. So it's way up there, not far from Lake Superior. And it's beautiful, it's quiet, I was surrounded by trees, lakes, forest animals, and I decided to make the Northwoods my home. And it's there where my true spiritual journey began. I live near the reservation of the Lac du Flambeau Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa. And on their reservation, there is a replica of a traditional Ojibwe village called Waswaganing. Waswaganing means Lake of the Flames in Ojibwe. On my first visit to the village, I immediately felt a strong physical and emotional connection. And I visited so often that eventually I became familiar enough with the village to lead tours and share with visitors how even the most mundane needs of the community were met by Mother Earth. I'll spare you from sharing my search for gainful employment. It was a challenge in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. But eventually I was fortunate enough to be hired by Great Lakes Intertribal Council as a project manager for their Vocational Rehabilitation for Native Americans project. Great Lakes Intertribal Council is a nonprofit consortium made up of the federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin and Upper Michigan. There's quite a few tribes involved. There are the bands of the Lake Superior Chippewa, which includes Lac du Flambeau, Red Cliff, Bad River, La Coudray, Lavaux Desert, the Sakagan tribes. And in addition to those, the Forest County Potawatomi, the Ho-Chunk Nation, the Menominee Indian tribe, the Oneida Nation, the St. Croix Chippewa, and the Stockbridge Munsee community. And what Great Lakes does is it applies for and implements various state and federal grants for the members of these communities. My position as a project manager required that I regularly visit the counselors working on the member tribes throughout the state. This afforded me the opportunity to learn a bit about each of the communities and their respective cultures. Also, every year an annual conference for our grant was held, and these were hosted by different tribes throughout the country. These events took me to Oklahoma City, Seattle, Santa Fe, and other locations. What I discovered was that while each tribe had their own versions of the creation story, art, food, music, and dance, all is connected to and influenced by their environment here on Mother Earth and expresses their gratitude for all that she gives. Now, I did check the website that Meredith directed me to and started reading some of the books on religious naturalism. As Meredith mentioned, some of them are pretty heady. And I don't consider myself to be very intellectually curious. I'm more of a gut feeling kind of person. And to be honest, I found that the science was a bit mind-numbing, at least for me it was. So I gave up the reading. Knowing how cells multiply and divide and the physics behind the cosmos and the Big Bang Theory is not what moves me. It's the beating of drums, the song of the flute, the singing and dancing to the rhythms of the earth, moon, and sun that bring me peace, and the feeling of being connected to, understanding the importance of, and grateful for being a part of the web. It's the mystery that I bow to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your story. I'm going to share I was going to try to share the discussion questions. I'm going to put them into the chat and I'll also try sharing again. So here are the discussion questions for you to think about while the song is playing. What do you think about the statement that when God is gone, everything is holy? How do you connect with a place very different from where you're from? When Laura and I were talking about that question, we were talking about the idea of that so many of us have come to Florida from different places. and just how it's so different to have different landscapes, different vegetation, different animals and insects, different people around. And so the sense of how do you connect with a place that's very different from where you're from? And then what does the seventh principle mean to you? And how do you recognize it, or how do you show it in your daily life? And again, the seventh principle in Unitarian Universalism is respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Again, those are in the chat as well. And I'm going to now play the song that you can think about while you're reflecting.